Our next panel is going to address the question, how does Christian nationalism threaten democracy? You see a list of names there, and I think we should have the panelists come on up front, first of all, to take a chair at the table up here. There are 4 chairs, because there are 4 panelists. And I think it would be great if we had them go in the order as we see them listed, which is, I'm going to say, first we have Reverend Dr. H. James Hopkins, who is the pastor of Lakeshore Avenue Baptist Church. He's also an alum of this institution. He's also a former board member. He's also former board chair. You know, he's been around for a while here at this particular institution. And he is going to start, followed by Dr. Laura Jean Torgerson, who is on our faculty here at Berkeley School of Theology, and she's assistant professor of New Testament studies here. And then Dr. Hannah Kang, who is our most recent full-time professor to come on full-time. Woohoo! And she is working in the arena of practical theology. And finally, we will have Professor James Grandison, who is an affiliate faculty member, and he teaches our courses in theology and ethics. Yes. So I am going to just hand the mic to you guys, and for, I think, I've let you all know because you came and talked to me, but 10 minutes. So I'll start the timer, and that'll give you a little clue when 10 minutes is up. All right.
Thank you, Dean Flesher, and thank you to you and to Dr. Evans and the Center for organizing this very important conversation. It's good to be in the room with so many respected colleagues and at the table with folks I look forward to learning from. Why is white Christian nationalism a threat to democracy? The late Sandra Day O'Connor, the first woman to serve on the United States Supreme Court, once said, "Those who would renegotiate the boundaries between church and state must therefore answer a difficult question. Why would we trade a system that has served us so well for one that has served others so poorly?" With these words, Justice O'Connor states succinctly the challenge before us. Religious nationalisms, like other nationalisms, are not a new thing in human history. Their force and power have waxed as they have waned, but the idea that the adherents of a particular theology, wrapped into the apparatus of a particular political philosophy, should have authority over all they come in contact with, has been tried repeatedly and repeatedly found wanting. Why, she asked, would we trade something that has been proven to work, democracy, for something that has been proven not to work, religious nationalism? Look what's going on in our world today. Is Islamic nationalism working? Is Buddhist nationalism working? Is Jewish nationalism working? Is white Christian nationalism working? Democracy is a system of governance in which power is vested in the people, who exercise that power directly, i.e. vote, or indirectly through elected representatives. It's characterized by principles such as political equality, free and fair elections, I know we're talking aspirational here, the rule of law, the protection of individual rights and freedoms. In a democratic society, citizens have the right to participate in decision-making processes and to hold their leaders accountable. So defined, democracy works, albeit imperfectly, much better than any system of religious nationalism has ever worked. Thus my main point. Christian nationalism threatens democracy by trying to replace something that has been proven to work, democracy, with something that has been proven not to work, religious nationalism, something superior with something inferior. Another way in which Christian nationalism threatens democracy is that while democracy thrives on truth, Christian nationalism thrives on the false narratives of national superiority, racial superiority, and religious superiority. Democracy is about honest debate, respectful dialogue, and shared decision-making. Christian nationalism advances false narratives of the history of the United States, the cause of the problems faced by our nation, and the interpretation of our sacred text. For example, Christian nationalism teaches that the United States was founded as a Christian nation, when in fact, it was founded as a nation that, while respecting religion, was careful not to give any single religion elevated status. Christian nationalism teaches that because the beliefs and practices of conservative Christianity have not been given precedence, the nation has been significantly weakened, when in fact, the policies and practices advocated by Christian nationalism would cause much pain and suffering. Christian nationalism teaches that Jesus sought to be a political leader, when in fact, he viewed that role as a temptation to be rejected. To be very clear, Jesus taught that the truth will make us free. Christian nationalism teaches that its own dogma will make us free. In this insistence, there is a clear threat to democracy. White Christian nationalism is at its heart exclusionary. It seeks to marginalize those who do not embrace it. In this, we have another example of the way it threatens democracy. Democracy, to be vibrant, needs the full and free participation of the citizenry. It needs the participation of those whose party is in power. It needs the full and free participation of those whose party is not in power. It needs the full and free participation of those who belong to no party. Consider the fact that white Christian nationalism is behind policies like putting the 10 Commandments on schoolhouse walls in Kentucky, replacing school counselors with school chaplains in the public schools of Texas, in mandating teaching the Bible in the public schools of Oklahoma. How do these policies make those who are not conservative white Christians feel? They cannot help them feel included, respected, appreciated, welcome, or safe. They cannot help them feel like they belong. Thus, they must be seen as threatening to a healthy democracy, for a sense of belonging is absolutely essential for democracy to flourish. These policies and practices, like many policies and practices advocated by white Christian nationalism, create an us versus them mentality. It creates a situation where opponents become enemies. These realities undermine democracy and democratic institutions. Democracy is about contending for the things one believes in. It's not about conquering one's opponents so thoroughly that they are forced out of the political process entirely. White Christian nationalism threatens democracy by demanding that Congress pass laws which establish one narrow set of religious practices as supreme, while expecting it at the same time to impede, if not prohibit, the free exercise of other faiths. Of course, this is antithetical to the way of Jesus. Jesus taught us to love our neighbors, to make their well-being central to our own existence. White Christian nationalism asks that instead of making the love of neighbors central to our faith, we make dictating to our neighbors central to our faith. I fail to see how this is good for us, good for our neighbors, good for democracy. The Reverend Benjamin Creamer puts it this way: nationalism keeps telling us Christians to take up our swords and make our nation Christian by any means necessary. Jesus keeps calling us Christians to take up our crosses and be like him, serving the world through grace, humility, compassion, and self-sacrificial love. Doesn't it seem that taking up our crosses, rather than taking up our swords, is much better for democracy?
The threat that white Christian nationalism poses to democracy was most visibly dramatized in the events of January 6th, 2021, when insurrectionists attacked the United States Capitol, melding crosses, prayers, and references to the Bible with U.S. and Confederate flags, political violence, and hate speech. This attack on our national legislature seeking to prevent the certification of the vote in the national presidential election powerfully illustrated what I see as the three kinds of ways that white Christian nationalism endangers democracy. First, they sought to prevent the enactment of a core practice of democracy, the certification of a democratic vote to elect the president. Second, this disregard for democracy occurred because the results of the democratic process were not consistent with white Christian nationalist ideals. And third, they used violence to attempt to overturn democracy. This insurrection also exemplified a key irony implicit in white Christian nationalist ideology that attacking the United States could be a way to save it. Here in Northern California, we can often seem far removed from both the nation's capital and the strongholds of white Christian nationalism. But these three endangering elements, engagement with democratic practices and institutions, anti-democratic ideologies, and the use of force, all three are present much closer to home, as I will share with you at the end of my 10 minutes. I want to be clear that I see white Christian nationalism as the fusion of three hierarchies of power within a particular political context, both nationally and internationally. This fusion is both dynamic and historically contingent, socially and culturally produced in recent years in response to fears both real and imagined. So, white Christian nationalism is an ideology in which whiteness and white people hold power over people of color, Black people, and indigenous people. One version of Christianity remains privileged over other versions of Christianity, other religions, and non-religious perspectives and people. And of course, the United States is privileged above all other nations. As a current phenomenon, however, white Christian nationalism contains multiple elements that are not inherent in the fusion of these three interlocking supremacies. Rather, because of its historical trajectory, white Christian nationalism also contains other features. This trajectory especially responds to decades of organizing by the so-called religious right, which was itself sparked by desegregation of public institutions, especially public schools. The culture wars through which we have passed, or maybe which we are still in, and deep fissures in what was the post-civil rights 20th century coalition of the Republican Party, a marriage between the interests of big business and social conservatism. And more recently, the Tea Party movement, which was in many ways a response to growing pluralism in terms of religion, race and ethnicity, and national origin. Because of its particular historical trajectory, white Christian nationalism melds those three supremacies with other elements. Now, the ideology of white Christian nationalism, being hierarchical, is ideologically at odds with democracy. In the words of religion and human rights scholar Dr. Laura Alexander, democratic ideals include at least the principles that all citizens of a country can participate fully in political life, and that all residents have the right to basic goods such as religious freedom and education. This ideological clash is what I identified as the second danger. In addition, the first element of danger is a complicated relationship to democratic institutions. White Christian nationalists can't always decide whether they want to overturn those institutions or be in charge of them. In this vein, it includes such elements as an emphasis on authoritarianism, consequentialism, the idea that the ends justify the means, conspiratorial thinking, and a feeling of being threatened by liberal ideas. The third danger is violence. And as I see it, violence has at least two required elements, both of which we see in white Christian nationalist movement. One is extreme vilification and demonization of anyone seen as the other. You have to dehumanize someone to allow yourself to harm them. And the other is gun rights activism, a method for inflicting violence. And these two combined lead to violence, right? So here are the 3 examples of where I have seen this ideology in my daily life in the last few weeks. The first one happened just yesterday as I was picking up my 13-year-old daughter from her school, and I noticed that the sidewalk was covered in chalk. And it was different Bible verses that people had written on the sidewalk. And I am a Christian pastor, and yet I was very uncomfortable seeing this, thinking about, as Dr. Hopkins alluded to, how the little girls who come to school in hijab feel about seeing that as they enter their school. And so somebody in our neighborhood, if they don't want Christianity in public schools, at least they want it as close as they can possibly get, on the very threshold. The second thing that I observed, and that is more an ideology, right? Well, it has to do with the relationship to institutions. We want Christianity in the schools. And the second thing I observed was driving up the part of 580 and 80 when they're merged, and there's these pedestrian bridges, and there were a bunch of Trump signs, but the big message said, "Will deport criminal aliens." And I haven't seen a clearer example of vilification of the other, that necessary element in becoming violent in service of your ideology. The third thing that I observed was driving my older daughter to take the SAT, and driving past a house that was covered in Trump signs. I'm pretty sure there was a flag of Israel, definitely a U.S. flag, but the banner that got my attention spelled it out, God, guns, and Trump. And this fusion of a fascination with, almost worship of guns and Christian religion is absolutely a part of white Christian nationalism as we are experiencing it. And when I think about the ways that sometimes the Constitution is sacralized in this discourse, it is interesting that there is a privileging of the Second Amendment both over the commandment not to kill and over the First Amendment, such that a tolerance of gun violence affects our freedom of assembly, our freedom of speech, our freedom of religion, even. And so I see these things that we would like to think are farther away than they are, and yet they are so intertwined with our life in various communities. Thank you.
Good afternoon. So let me start by acknowledging that I initially struggled to grasp the full meaning of Christian nationalism and its varied effects on U.S. society. Having grown up in a country with multiple major religions, none of which dominate, the idea that nationalism, the belief that loyalty to one's country should surpass all other interests, could be married to a dominant religion, was hard for me to comprehend. As a result, I will approach this topic as an outsider, meaning not someone disinterested, but rather someone whose worldview was shaped by a very different cultural context. From this outsider perspective, Christian nationalism, or the union of a specific sort of Christianity and the American civic life, is very perplexing. However, the question is not whether the U.S. was, is, or should be a Christian nation. Rather, as Whitehead and Perry argue, the more important focus is what Christian nationalism and its beliefs do to people, not just those who uphold them, but also to those who disagree and, like me, who find the ideology just puzzling. And I believe that Christian nationalism contributes to division in society rather than unity. But this division is not the kind we often see in a healthy democracy, where people with vastly different views learn how to coexist and even collaborate despite their disagreements. The division created by Christian nationalism is characterized by hostility, and worse, it often justifies as prohibition, as Dr. Hopkins said, or vilification of others, even militarism against others. And this logic is possible because at its core, Christian nationalism carries a religious endorsement that suggests that God has been on the side of Americans since the country's inception and will continue to bless the nation as long as they follow God's commandments and the right order. And this belief leads to the conviction that the government should favor Christianity in public policy and also civic life. And anyone who disagrees is not only opposing a political ideology, but also opposing God and the divine order. So this divisive ideology has significant ramifications for our contemporary society. And this afternoon, I want to focus specifically on how Christian nationalism imposes a rigid moral order on gender and sexuality, creating further division. So echoing Whitehead and Perry, I understand Christian nationalism to have a religious component, but it is not a religion itself. Rather, it is a blend of political, ethnic, and religious values that function as a cultural framework for interpreting the world. So in this context, Christianity is not tied to any particular denomination, but represents a broader ideology, a mix of conservative political thoughts, biblical literalism, apocalyptic visions, and divine militarism. So given these tenets, it makes sense that Christian nationalists, like many political conservatives, advocate for a traditional gender order where men lead and women submit. And this perspective holds that male leadership and militant masculinism are God-given roles essential for building a healthy family, which in turn is seen as the cornerstone of a healthy society that will be pleasing to God. So following this worldview, the breakdown of male dominance within the family eventually leads to societal problems that we see today, such as violence, drug abuse, and etc. So Christian nationalists would argue that this proper God-ordained gender role must be restored and must be upheld to preserve not only a healthy family, but a social well-being that God has intended. Thus, even though female leadership exists within Christian nationalism, such as Republican Marjorie Taylor Greene, it rises as an extension of this traditional patriarchal gender roles, as advocates of the biblical view of female submission, or as nurturers or spiritual mothers for other Christian nationalist women in certain areas deemed appropriate or proper for women, rather than challenging patriarchy or male authority in pursuit of full gender equality. And this rigid definition of gender roles not only places men in the position of absolute leadership within the family and society, but also shapes their views on LGBTQ+ rights. As public opinion in the US has shifted toward greater acceptance of LGBTQ+ rights, Christian nationalists see this not only as a sign of moral decay, but also as a threat to their religious freedom to discriminate it. So the LGBTQ issues are not only about sexuality or morality, but become a matter of their religious freedom. And the emphasis on traditional gender roles sound familiar to me, as I come from a culture influenced by Confucianism, which similarly reinforces a hierarchical gender order where women are subordinate to men and holds a conservative view on sexuality. And they have one thing in common. Both Confucianism and Christian nationalism provide a code of behavior that shapes people's belief systems in general. However, while the traditional Confucian interpretation of gender roles is a widely known ideology that lives in the psyche of many people in East Asian countries and creates cultural norms and patriarchal expectations that are repressive to women, it is not a religious movement nor a political movement. The US Christian nationalism, on the contrary, actively engages a theological dimension, religious language, where God is linked to a specific nation, creating a binary framework with an apocalyptic vision. Either its citizens maintain God's ordained order and are blessed, or they stray from it and they're punished. Therefore, I think this is more dangerous. Christian nationalism is more dangerous and is more insidious as it frames gender equality and LGBTQ rights as an attack to the Christian order. So it's more than an ideology. It's just deeply rooted in their religious doctrines, and it's more than a religion. It has a political agenda. It seeks to influence laws and public opinions, like their opposition to the Equality Act. In conclusion, Christian nationalism presents a significant challenge to the values of equality and democracy, particularly with its rigid views on gender and sexuality. Unlike Confucianism, which creates a patriarchal expectations through cultural norms, Christian nationalism weaponizes religious beliefs to shape public policy, asserting that God's favor hinges on upholding a specific social and gender order. This ideology not only divides society, but also conflates political dissent with religious heresy, framing gender equality and LGBTQ plus rights as threats to the nation's divine destiny. And this blend of religious and political power makes it especially dangerous to democratic principles, as it undermines the pluralism and inclusivity that are the foundation of a just society. Thank you.
I already want to start commenting on my colleagues' remarks already. Don't start my 10 minutes yet. I'm going to take a slightly different approach and share an experience I had last year. So last year, I visited the Albemarle County estate in Virginia of one of the founding fathers of the United States and former President Thomas Jefferson. I visited the Monticello estate to see the restored slave quarters that once housed Sally Hemings and her children. Hemings was an enslaved woman who bore 6 children by Jefferson. She was not free and did not know freedom. Jefferson was the architect of the most important document of our democracy, the Declaration of Independence. Yet he kept men, women, and children enslaved on a farm he was so proud of. A man who espoused independence and freedom for all people in a new nation, forced human beings to be slaves on his own farm, in his own home. Jefferson's estate was beautiful and historic. After viewing the architecture and interior designs and the exterior grounds, I turned my attention to the Monticello estate's slave quarters. The tour guide provided some explanation of the daily life of the African enslaved people who once lived and survived there. She explained Jefferson generated his financial resources through his farm that was tended to by the enslaved people who lived in those slave quarters. As I stood outside of the estate, taking in the majestic views of the Shenandoah Valley, I had one final question. That question was, what did Jefferson farm? Why was this question important, one might ask? It was important because throughout the narrative of this tour, it was constantly made clear that Jefferson was always in debt. He was in a perpetual debt where he simply could not overcome. It was made clear that his appetites for his lifestyle exceeded his ability to afford his habits of lavishness and pleasure. It was also made clear that had not Jefferson not been the architect of the Declaration of Independence and a former president, his debt collectors would have confiscated his dear Monticello. To make matters worse, Jefferson was known to have made promises to free the enslaved people on his farm, but the value of these quote unquote assets were so important for him to continue to borrow money to pay off his debtors. He could not set his slaves free. Jefferson was in a cycle of debt. The function of Jefferson's farm was to pay for his lifestyle, which in turn would pay his debts. If one works with Jefferson's, quote, theory of intentions, unquote, it can be asserted that if he was free from debt, he would be free to set free the enslaved people on his farm. When the tour guide answered my question about what Jefferson farmed, she simply said, wheat. Wheat is not a profitable crop in Virginia. And Jefferson's farm his farm grew primarily wheat. Sad but true. As I looked out over this majestic valley in Virginia with its gentle rolling hills, I was crushed while thinking Sally Hemings and her young children never had a chance to be free with this, with this man growing wheat on this hillside. It's untenable. Today, Virginia grows 1% of the United States annual production of wheat. It is simply not a state to grow such a crop, to generate the type of wealth to support the opulent lifestyle Jefferson aspired to live. Beyond the pure sadness of enslavement of African people from historical accounts, Jefferson knew slavery was immoral and needed to be eradicated from the American colonies and the new nation. In the end, he trafficked in human enslavement as a means to his end, ends that he could not quite ever reconcile with his financial balance sheets. Utilizing the social and cultural values of the constructs of white supremacy, he justified his decision as necessary to retain his own slaves, even his own enslaved children. Still, he could not lift his debt. The 18th century founder of the Declaration of Independence lived a life wedged between his ambition and lifestyle's debt. As a convenience, he used white supremacy to maintain his lifestyle to the end of his days. In essence, his lifestyle was a paradox to democratic values. Those values are human freedom, equality, and justice. According to Philip Gorski and Samuel Perry in their book, The Flag and the Cross, they claim that Christian nationalism has shaped American popular culture. The religio-political vision of Christian nationalists espouses the governmental institutionalization of the Christian religion based upon their ideology. I don't call it theology. I tell my students, as soon as you assert your self-interest into your scriptural interpretation, You're exercising ideology, not theology, because theology needs to be God-focused. That's the object and the subject, not personal self-interest. Where they assert the necessity of their religious values. This religious freedom is based upon their God-given right to possess this land in North America, as they declare God has given them this right. They affirm their interpretation of Christian values and claim that the actions they take to secure their religious freedom and values is inherently justifiable. They are asserting the legitimization of authoritarian rule as a means to an end to their political goals. Gorski and Perry connects these stances in three ways: by the right to assert their freedom, by maintaining social and racial order, and by engaging in violence as a means to an end for their vision. The utilization of their end times theology, their paradigm, not a theology, it's an ideology. It's an ideology. It's an ideology. It's an ideology, not a theology. God is in theology. When God ain't in it, and self-interest is, doesn't matter who you are, even if you're mean, if you're me, it's an ideological paradigm. Is used as a justification for authoritarian rule and violence, according to Gorski and Perry. The underlying theme supporting this vision and these stances is the hierarchy of human value. That is white supremacy, which is the vehicle which has historically created the dialectical tension of the us versus them dynamic in the American context. The us versus them dynamic existed from the earliest days of the formation of British American colonies, the founding of this nation, the Civil War, Reconstruction, post-Reconstruction period, Jim Crow days, and the Civil Rights Movement to the present day. In nearly every respect imaginable, for Christian nationalists to obtain their desired goals, it would undermine the democratic freedom and liberties of other people because it can only be achieved through authoritarianism. Authoritarianism runs contrary to a democracy that is, as Abraham Lincoln stated in his Gettysburg Address, quote, that of a government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth, unquote. Lincoln's vision was that of a united nation maintaining freedom and liberty for all, working together to resolve differences, building up its institutions that foster stability and prosperity while forever being free of slavery. Christian nationalism threatens the nation's mediating institutions such as our families, neighborhoods, religious institutions, and voluntary associations. It destabilizes our way of life and our checks and balances between the three branches of government, which in turn would destabilize our economy and our ability to attract investments in our financial markets. Christian nationalism under authoritarian rule would overturn the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. It would deny American citizens and lawful immigrants of their freedoms and rights that have long been affirmed under the Constitution. Authoritarian rule is subject to its leaders' decisions and not the rule of law. The rule of law provides a sense of stability and social order based upon a prescribed set of rules under the law that is subject to the courts. When it comes to Christian nationalists, the freedoms and rights of people are determined by the whims of the authority and not codified law that every person, and when applicable, every institution are subject to. This means our freedoms and rights and hearings before the courts are likely to be unpredictable due to the destabilizing effects and disorder caused by authoritarian rule. Authoritarian rule centralizes power to the hands of a few people, whereas democratic rule decentralizes power with its checks and balances balance of powers. The task for us is obvious. We have to work together to stop Christian nationalist aims in order to preserve the freedoms and liberties with a clear sense of justice for all people as the Declaration intended.